Before the first empires were carved into the earth, before the names of nations echoed in the chambers of history, there were only stories whispered in silence. Not yet spoken aloud, not yet written in stone, only carried by the breath of the divine. And in that silence, a thread was spun. Not a thread of chance, but of intention, of design, of memory too old to be remembered, and yet too sacred to be forgotten. We often believe that history moves forward like an arrow, clean, direct, inevitable. But that is illusion. True history, sacred history, moves in spirals. It curves through realms seen and unseen. It weaves people, prophets, kings, and shepherds together in patterns too intricate to grasp in a single lifetime. A nation rises not merely by conquest, but by alignment with forces beyond its own understanding. And what if behind every throne, behind every prophecy, behind every battle, there was something or someone watching? Powers rise, empires fall, but some names refuse to vanish. Persia is one of those names. Not merely a nation of warriors and rulers, not just an ancient civilization remembered in golden reliefs and forgotten ruins, but a spiritual cipher, a code scattered through sacred texts and celestial visions. Persia is a mystery revealed not in full, but in fragments. And yet those fragments, once gathered, speak of something astonishing, a people chosen not once, but again and again, to serve in the unfolding of a cosmic drama. Most know Persia through the lens of conquest. Fewer know it as a cradle of light. Fewer still see its duality, the paradox of a nation anointed to rebuild the holy temple and later named among those who rise against the people of God. What kind of story is this? How can a nation hold both redemption and rebellion within its script? And more urgently, why does it matter now? Because this thread, the one that runs from Elam and Madai in the book of Genesis, through kings like Cyrus and visionaries like Daniel, through the Magi who followed a star, still moves. It has not been cut. And in these times of global uncertainty, when nations rage and headlines blur prophecy with politics, that ancient thread might be pulling tighter. You are not holding this book by accident. You are not hearing these words by chance. The thread has found you too. Some nations appear in sacred texts as footnotes, glimpses, warnings, shadows cast against the chosen ones. Others, however, pulse like secret arteries through the body of spiritual history. Persia is such a nation. Her name is spoken not just in scripture, but in silence, between lines, behind prophecies, embedded in dreams dreamt by kings and captives alike. To understand Persia is to accept that there are patterns larger than reason. She was the hand that opened the gates of Jerusalem after 70 years of exile, and yet she is also listed among the final adversaries in the vision of the world's last war. She nurtured prophets in her courts, and she silenced them with iron. She bowed to stars and followed them across deserts, and she later forgot the heavens altogether. But the story of Persia is not a contradiction. It is a mirror reflecting humanity itself, rising, falling, remembering, forgetting, being called, resisting, returning. And maybe that is the deeper mystery, that nations like people have souls. The scriptures say that God speaks through history, not only through thunder or burning bushes. He speaks through timelines, bloodlines, destinies unfolding like scrolls in the wind. If so, then what is Persia but one of his sacred verses, misunderstood, misquoted, but never erased? Every time she appears in the biblical narrative, she is doing more than acting in politics. She is revealing something about judgment, about mercy, about power that kneels before something greater than itself. Perhaps this is why the Bible speaks her name in both reverence and warning. And perhaps this is why ancient wisdom, from Zoroastrian hymns to the visions of Urantia, keeps circling back to her soil, as if the earth itself remembers something we have forgotten. To read this story is to listen beneath history, is to see the face behind the mask of empire, is to understand that no kingdom, no prophet, no war, no liberation happens in isolation. Everything is watched, everything is woven. And Persia, ancient Persia, is one of the golden threads holding the tapestry together. We begin not with her rise, nor with her fall, but with her essence, scattered across time like stardust, waiting to be reassembled. These pages are not a chronicle. They are a revelation. And just as Persia once walked between shadow and light, so now do we. The thread is not behind us. It is ahead. The story of Persia does not begin with empires. It begins with water. Long before the Zoroastrian fires, before the carved stone of Persepolis, before Cyrus raised a decree that set a people free, there was a flood. Not a local flood, not a myth, a reckoning, a baptism by chaos. Earth itself was cleansed, and with that cleansing came silence, a pause in the symphony of history so profound that even the stars, it seemed, waited to breathe again. From the silence, life emerged once more. A family stepped onto a new earth, Noah and his sons, bearing the memory of a world lost and the seed of one not yet formed. They were not kings. They had no cities, no banners, but they carried something greater, the genetic spark of future civilizations and the unseen imprint of divine guardianship. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were more than names. They were directions in the unfolding of destiny, and from them would rise not just peoples, but patterns. Genesis chapter 10 reads like a list to the untrained eye, a genealogy, a tangle of fathers and sons. But encoded in those verses is a hidden architecture. It is the Bible's first map of nations, etched not on parchment, but in blood. It tells us of Madai, son of Japheth, and Elam, son of Shem. These two names are not incidental. They're the ancestral spirits of what would one day be called Persia. Madai settled in the harsh northern highlands, where the mountains trained his descendants in endurance and independence. They became the Medes, rugged, tribal, fiercely self-possessed. To live in the mountains is to live in constant conversation with the sky, and the people of Madai became skybound in their imagination, even as they remained rooted in stone. Elam, in contrast, descended into the lush southwestern valleys near the ancient Persian Gulf. His children, the Elamites, became masters of lowland fertility, building early urban centers in what is now Kazakhstan. Where the Medes were carved by austerity, the Elamites flourished in the softness of abundance. Yet both carried something elemental, a silent call that would echo through millennia. These two houses, born of different sons, occupied one land, and from their tension, a deeper identity began to form, not merely political, but spiritual. For the land they walked was not neutral. It was charged. Something ancient had already marked it. And here, beneath the surface of the Genesis account, the book of Urantia whispers an additional dimension. It speaks of the anointed, those semi-spiritual progenitors of civilization who scattered across the earth carrying fragments of a light too vast to be contained in one region. These anointed, descendants of the Adamic lineage, brought agriculture, metallurgy, and the memory of celestial things into the waking world. And among them, Urantia tells us, were the seeds of the Iranian peoples. But this dispersal was not chaos, it was orchestration. The diffusion of races after Babel, the spreading of tongues and lineages, was not merely punishment for pride. It was preparation. The world needed distance to generate diversity. And in the cradle of Persia, a certain balance emerged, a fusion of endurance and refinement, mountains and valleys, memory and vision. It is no coincidence that the very first recorded international conflict in the Bible involves Elam. In Genesis 14, for kings from the east, including Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, march westward in conquest. They plunder cities, enslave peoples, and take captive a nephew of a man whose name would become synonymous with faith, Abram. And so, from the very beginning, Elam is not a passive backdrop. It is a force, not just geographically, but spiritually. The first war in the biblical record is not merely political. It is a war of dimensions, a clash between those driven by dominion and one man moved by covenant. Abram, with only 318 servants, defeats the coalition of kings. It should have been impossible, but it wasn't, because sacred history does not obey the laws of power. Persia, even in her earliest forms, did not merely exist upon the land. She communed with it. The geography itself seemed to awaken something in the people who lived there. Mountains that broke the sky like jagged prayers. Deserts that stripped illusions to the bone. Valleys that invited reflection and memory. There is something alchemical in such a landscape. It demands transformation. It does not permit complacency. Every tribe that walked those soils became, over time, a participant in a deeper narrative, one written not by scribes, but by wind, dust, and time. In the eyes of the ancients, mountains were more than obstacles or fortresses. They were thresholds, places where heaven bent low enough for men to listen. Moses ascended Sinai and found commandments. Zoroaster, it is said, heard Ahura Mazda whisper between peaks. And Abraham, after rescuing Lot from the eastern kings, stood alone under the stars and was told that his descendants would outnumber them. These events, though separated by tradition and time, resonate with a single idea. Revelation is often given where the earth reaches upward. This is the spiritual grammar of Persia, elevation through struggle, vision through solitude. The terrain formed the soul of a people long before their cities did. To survive, they're meant to understand rhythm, not just survival. The rhythm of seasons, of silence, of stars. And in that rhythm, something ancient stirred. The book of Urantia speaks of how certain regions were seeded not only with physical resources, but with genetic and spiritual potential. Persia and the broader Mesopotamian crescent was one such region. It absorbed migrations of Andites and Edomites, carriers of both cultural refinement and cosmic memory. These groups brought with them rudimentary astronomy, the early seeds of monotheism, and a sense that the human journey was being observed from above, not by distant gods, but by spiritual overseers invested in our becoming. And so, while to many, Elam and Madai are just names lost in genealogical dust, to those with eyes to see, they are archetypal ancestors, reflections of deeper forces. Elam, the lush dreamer, tied to water and memory. Madai, the ascetic climber, bound to stone and vision. When they merged through blood, war, and time, the result was not only political fusion, it was the birth of a spiritual paradox. A nation destined to hold both sword and scroll, fire and wisdom, mercy and conquest. It is not by accident that both Elam and Madai reappear again and again throughout the sacred narrative, even when their names change, even when their cities are renamed, even when their borders are forgotten. Persia does not vanish. She adapts. She survives invasions not only of armies, but of language, belief, and identity. And in each iteration, something persists, a hunger for the transcendent that is at once ancient and urgent. This is not nostalgia. It is recognition. The Persians, long before they were Persians, carried something that could not be colonized. A memory not of what had been, but of what was coming. A whisper from the future. And that is why, when their kings appear in Scripture, when their wise men follow stars, when their empires touch Jerusalem, the text trembles. Because something buried and vast is moving again. All of this begins not in power, but in pattern. In the deep current beneath human history that turns shepherds into prophets and forgotten regions into cradles of cosmic intention. And so we begin here, not because Persia was first in glory, but because Persia was first in echo, an echo from the beginning of beginnings. The Genesis was not only of the world, but of souls. And Persia, it seems, was listening. Before Sinai, before tablets etched in fire, before prophets wandered the hills of Judea with voices full of thunder and ash, there was another voice, clear, resolute, luminous. It rose not from the deserts of Canaan, but from the highlands of ancient Iran, where wind and silence were the oldest scriptures. His name was Zarathustra, or as the Greeks would later call him, Zoroaster. And through him, light spoke. Little is certain about the exact century he walked the earth, and perhaps that is fitting. His life resists being pinned to chronology. He feels more like a tremor that shaped time than a man simply caught within it. But what endures across ruins, across revisions, across ritual, is the clarity of his call. In a world drunk with 1,000 gods, Zoroaster proclaimed one, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, uncreated, eternal, supreme not because he ruled over other deities, but because he was alone and enough. It was a revelation that echoed like a bell through the canyons of ancient faith. Not a god of vengeance, not a god of whim, but of truth, of light, of thought that creates reality. And this god, said Zoroaster, had an adversary, not an equal, but a defier, Ungra Mainyu, the spirit of deception and shadow. And so emerged the sacred drama of dualism, not in cosmic balance, but in moral warfare. The world was a battleground between Asha, truth, order, divine alignment, and Drej, falsehood, chaos, spiritual entropy. But man, said the prophet, was not a spectator. He was the axis. Each soul was born into this cosmic tension. Each thought, each action tipped the scales. Righteousness was not ritual. It was choice. It was the courage to stand with the light even when shadow ruled the day. This was not law imposed from outside. It was law discovered within. The earliest form of conscience, written not on tablets, but into being itself. There is a reason Zoroaster's voice was heard far beyond his homeland. Something in it transcended tribe and time. His teachings found sanctuary in the hearts of kings, in the rituals of the Magi, in the structure of empire. But more profoundly, they found resonance in the very architecture of the sacred. For when Melchizedek, as the Urantia Book reveals, came to Salem nearly 2,000 years before Christ, teaching the gospel of one true God, he too planted seeds in the hearts of many peoples. And among those who received them, the ancestors of the Persians were not absent. Urantia speaks of Melchizedek's mission as a global flame, one that touched Egypt, India, Greece, and yes, the Iranian plateau. Though distorted by the passage of time and the fallibility of men, the essence remained. A divine unity, a moral universe, a coming Redeemer. What Zoroaster revealed was not entirely new, but it was purified, intensified, awakened anew in a land waiting for fire. And so, within the Magi, those keepers of sacred knowledge in the later Persian Empire, there flowed not just the memory of Zoroaster, but a deeper river. They studied the stars not only for omens, but for patterns, for prophecies. They preserved scrolls, interpreted dreams, tracked the rhythms of history. And when a child was born in a distant province under Roman occupation, when a star appeared that did not move with the heavens, it was the Magi, who remembered. They remembered that Zoroaster had spoken of a Saoshyant, a savior yet to come. They remembered that goodness must incarnate to vanquish evil. They remembered, perhaps, that time is not linear, but spirals toward a single point, a birth, a return, a flame reigniting what the world forgot. The Magi who studied the stars from Persian courts were not merely astronomers or priests in ceremonial robes. They were inheritors of a sacred memory, a memory of a world where thought was a force, where speaking the truth aligned reality with the divine. Their rituals were precise, not because they were superstitious, but because they believed the cosmos listened. Every fire lit was not a symbol. It was a portal. Every chant was not a performance. It was a tuning of the soul with a harmony that sustains creation. And in their schools, hidden within the empire's grandeur, they passed down whispers not only of Ahura Mazda, but of one who would come in human form to defeat the lie once and for all. This savior, the Saoshyant, would be born of a virgin, would rise against the darkness in the final days, and would restore the world to its original light. The Magi watched the sky not in hope, but in expectation. This is why, when Jerusalem fell to Babylon and the people of the covenant were taken captive into the heart of the Persian realm, something unexpected happened. Their grief did not extinguish prophecy, it magnified it. In exile, under foreign stars, among strange languages and unfamiliar gods, the Hebrew soul did not wither. It adapted. It remembered its own revelations. And then, in the shadow of Zoroastrian temples, it began to recognize there is something sacred in the meeting of two revelations, not in conquest, not in assimilation, but in reflection, when one faith sees its own truths mirrored in the flame of another. That is what happened in the long twilight of Babylonian captivity. Jewish thinkers, scribes, and prophets, from Ezekiel to Daniel, stood in the presence of Persian cosmology and did not reject it outright. They discerned. They saw in Ahura Mazda a shadow of their own Elohim. They heard in Zoroaster's teachings an echo of Moses' law, not in letter, but in spirit. They found in the battle between light and darkness a parallel to their own struggle between obedience and rebellion. And perhaps, most profoundly, they began to contemplate more deeply the nature of the world to come. Heaven and hell, angels and demons, resurrection and judgment. Themes that were present but quiet in early Israelite thought began to bloom in dialogue with the Persian vision. This was not imitation. It was amplification. The Jewish soul had always sensed the arc of history bending toward redemption, but in exile, it began to speak of it with new clarity. The idea of a messianic figure, a chosen one who would restore justice and peace, emerged more vividly. Not as a warrior king alone, but as one who carried divine authority, moral perfection, and spiritual power. And when that figure finally arrived, centuries later, he would be sought not by priests from Jerusalem, but by Magi from the East. It is a poetic symmetry too perfect to ignore. Those who first named the light, who kept its sacred fire alive, through centuries of ritual and revelation, were the first to kneel before its incarnate form. Zoroaster never met Moses. He never walked through Jerusalem. His fire temples never touched the soil of Israel. And yet, his voice, rising from a distant mountain, joined the choir of those who prepared the way. He did not bring the law, but he brought the light before the law, a light that still flickers, not just in ancient manuscripts or forgotten rituals, but in every soul that dares to choose truth in the midst of confusion. And so his story is not foreign to sacred history. It is part of its architecture. It is one of the early flames in the long corridor of revelation that leads not to a single altar, but to a convergence where wisdom, memory, and spirit meet and call humanity home. Some names enter sacred history with fire, others with silence. But Cyrus came like a whisper wrapped in thunder. The prophets had already spoken of him before he was born, not in riddles, but in clarity. They called him not a king, not a warrior, but something far more dangerous to every earthly power: anointed, chosen, a vessel not of his own ambition, but of the will of the Most High. I summon you by name, wrote Isaiah, though you do not know me. And with those words, the stage of history shifted. Cyrus of Persia was not raised in the temple courts. He did not walk the hills of Judea, nor sit at the feet of Israel's teachers. He was born of mountain blood, shaped by a land where sovereignty was carved into rock. He commanded legions, not psalms. And yet, it was this man whom the God of Israel called his shepherd. At first glance, it seems impossible. How could a pagan emperor become the hand of divine justice? How could one outside the covenant become the fulfillment of prophecy? But this paradox is not a mistake. It is the key. For in the architecture of sacred history, God does not only anoint priests. He anoints kings. He anoints empires. He bends the machinery of human power toward mercy. Not always, not forever, but at appointed times. When the Babylonians razed the temple and scattered the chosen people, it seemed that the light had gone out. Psalmists wept by foreign rivers. Priests mourned their silence. The heavens, once so full of covenant and fire, felt impossibly distant. But even in exile, the watchmen had not fallen asleep. Isaiah had written of one who would come from the east, subduing kings, opening gates that no man could shut. Daniel, taken as a captive into Babylon's grandeur, interpreted dreams with trembling precision, visions of kingdoms rising and falling like breath. And through it all, one name began to rise from the horizon like a hidden sun: Cyrus. He did not conquer Babylon with brute force. He entered it almost as a breath, a military campaign wrapped in divine choreography. The gates were opened from within. The city fell without blood, and with it fell the final illusion that God's work must always be done by those who bear his name. Sometimes, the holy work is entrusted to hands that do not yet know they are clean. Cyrus issued a decree unlike anything the world had heard. Not only did he allow the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem, he funded the rebuilding of their temple. He returned the stolen vessels of gold and silver. He honored a God he had never worshipped in his youth. And in doing so, he became a cosmic hinge, a point where judgment turned into restoration. The book of Urantia speaks of the divine administration not as myth, but as structure, layers of celestial guidance shaping planetary evolution. It tells of planetary princes, system sovereigns, most highs, and Melchizedek regents, coordinating epochs of light and darkness. And at times, when the world tilts too far, when the divine plan requires a sharp turn, they intervene, not through miracles alone, but through people, through civilizations, through kings. Cyrus was such an intervention. He was not perfect. He did not understand the full weight of what he was doing. But the currents that moved him were not merely geopolitical. They were galactic. He was a redemptive bridge, a temporal nation raised for a holy purpose. And when that purpose was complete, he passed, like all great instruments, into history. But the vibration of his obedience still echoes. There is a term that can only be understood by those who see history through sacred eyes, a redemptive nation. Not eternal, not flawless, but positioned in time to carry out a task in service of the divine pattern. Persia, under Cyrus, became this. For one shimmering moment, an empire served as a vessel for the healing of another people's trauma. Not through conversion, through justice. To call Cyrus a messianic figure is not to confuse him with the Messiah himself. It is to understand that messianism is not confined to one arrival, one moment, one face. It is a rhythm, a pulse of divine intervention echoing across time. Isaiah's use of the term anointed for a foreign king was not poetic exaggeration. It was a theological earthquake. It broke open the categories. It challenged the idea that sacredness was limited by bloodline or creed. It introduced the dangerous idea that God could move through unexpected vessels, through outsiders, through strangers, through kings who wore the wrong crowns. And this, too, is Urantia's whisper beneath the text, that God does not abandon the unfolding world to chance. That spiritual administration is not a myth of the devout, but a pattern as real as gravity, only subtler, hidden in the folds of causality. The Most High's rule in the kingdoms of men, not overtly, not with lightning, but with influence layered deep within time. The rise of Persia under Cyrus was not just the fall of Babylon. It was the rebalancing of a planetary timeline that had begun to drift. It is easy to imagine history as a line moving forward, but it is more accurate to see it as a field, moments rising and falling like waves under the breath of greater currents. In that field, there are anchor points, moments that carry more weight than others. Cyrus was one of those moments. He did not just change policy. He fulfilled something. He was a hinge between judgment and return, between captivity and covenant, between despair and divine memory. And yet, the glory of redemptive nations is always temporary. Their calling is not to reign forever, but to serve in a single, luminous task, and then release it. Persia was not meant to hold the throne of Jerusalem, only to open its gates. Cyrus was not meant to become the voice of Israel's God, only to obey it, even if unknowingly. There is a humility in this kind of greatness, one that surpasses the monuments of emperors. It is the greatness of being used by something infinitely larger than oneself. This is the secret heartbeat of sacred history, that no empire lasts, but every empire is watched, not judged by its conquests, but by its obedience to a single moment of calling. The Babylonian throne was judged and found wanting. The Persian throne, for a time, aligned with heaven. And so it is with all thrones, all nations, all lives. The measure is not how long one holds power, but what one does with the power while it lasts. Cyrus passed. The Persian Empire, too, would pass. But for a brief window of time, an empire of mountains and fire became the servant of light. It gave back what others had stolen. It made possible what grief had undone. It became a vessel not of domination, but of restoration. And that is why his name still echoes. Not because he built an empire, but because he became, for one breath in history, a mirror of something divine. The justice he brought was not only political. It was prophetic. It was cosmic. And the temple he helped rebuild was more than stone. It was a promise. There are moments in sacred history when the veil thins, not by storm, not by ritual, but by presence. When a single life becomes a hinge, a prism, through which eternity bends itself into time. Daniel was such a life. He did not seek the fire of prophecy. He was taken from home, from temple, from language, carried away into the glittering captivity of Babylon. And yet, it was there, not in Jerusalem, that his eyes were opened. He was a teenager when the temple fell, when the walls cracked and the sacred vessels were defiled. He entered Babylon not as a prophet, but as a servant. The empire renamed him, trained him, dressed him in their language, their customs, their logic. But they could not clothe his soul. Beneath every title they gave him, Daniel remained what they could not see, a man tethered to something the empire could not touch. And in that stillness, visions came. Unlike the prophets who raged in the wilderness or thundered in temple courts, Daniel listened. He dreamed. He watched in silence. As symbols unfolded, not only the fate of Israel, but the very structure of history itself. His language was not merely Hebrew or Aramaic. It was the language of time. A statue with a head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and feet of iron and clay. Not simply a vision of empires, but a cosmic parable. Each metal not only denoted a kingdom, but carried a resonance, an archetypal vibration. Gold, purity, divine order, the crown untouched. Silver, refinement, duality, the age of law and priesthood. Bronze, strength of will, expansion, the fire of conquest. Iron, harsh logic, division, the age of machinery. And then clay, humanity itself, fragile, unpredictable, spiritual, and yet bound to the dust. This was not chronology. This was a sacred topology, a symbolic map of the soul of civilization. Daniel saw not only what would happen, he saw how the spirit of an age wears its power. And he saw the great arc, the ascent from unity into multiplicity, from light into shadow, and the long return towards something eternal. He was not only interpreting the king's dream, he was interpreting the rhythm of ages. The book of Urantia speaks of planetary epochs, not as accidents of culture, but as dispensations, windows in which new revelation is introduced by celestial agents. Daniel, unknowingly perhaps, stood at the cusp of such a turning. His visions were not his alone. They were transmissions shaped by a higher administration that knew precisely where humanity stood in the great spiral of development. The empires he named were not only political regimes, they were spiritual conditions, manifestations of collective consciousness on a planetary scale. And what the Hermetic teachings would later echo, that as above, so below, is alive in every image Daniel recorded. He saw the macrocosm in the microcosm. He knew that what a king dreams in his chamber is but the ripple of a greater wave moving through the heavens. And he wrote it down not for his own time, but for the time to come. A time when language would lose its sacredness, when prophecy would be confined to sentiment, and when empires would rise not by divine permission, but by the illusion of autonomy. Daniel's visions shattered that illusion. He saw beasts rise from the sea, not monsters of myth, but embodiments of nations untethered from spirit. He saw thrones set in fire, and a figure like a son of man brought before the Ancient of Days. He saw weeks not of days, but of years, folding in upon themselves like breath. He saw the end not as destruction, but as unveiling. Daniel was not merely a recorder of future events. He was a cartographer of meaning. His visions formed a map not of places, but of when, and not in linear time, but in layered time. The 70 weeks he saw in vision, the timed redemption, the countdown to the anointed one, all of it functioned not as fortune-telling, but as a calendrical unveiling of divine rhythm. The Messiah was not to come at random. His arrival was mathematically embedded in the scroll of time itself. Every war, every captivity, every decree, like gears in a cosmic clock, turned toward that singular incarnation. But this calendar was more than prophetic. It was alive. It pulsed with celestial timing. It hinted at something far greater than one nation's destiny. It suggested that the world itself was under observation, that unseen watchers, as Daniel called them, monitored not just behavior, but belief, that the rise of kings and the fall of cities were not merely the consequences of politics or pride, but responses to deeper spiritual alignment. What Daniel revealed was a sacred governance, a structure not visible to the eyes, but encoded in dream and symbol. Urantia expands this idea beyond metaphor. It presents a cosmology in which spiritual administrators, beings of staggering wisdom and patience, oversee worlds not to control them, but to guide their growth. Earth, or Urantia, is not an abandoned sphere. It is a project in motion, and the appearance of prophets like Daniel is not spontaneous, but coordinated. They are inserted into history like threads woven at precise angles, balancing a pattern too vast for any single generation to grasp. Daniel's gift was not only the ability to see, but to wait, to carry the weight of visions no one around him understood, to serve wicked kings without becoming wicked, to decode divine symbols in the language of empire and still speak with the clarity of heaven. He did not rise through rebellion. He rose through stillness. And it was that stillness that made him trustworthy. What the world saw as dream, Daniel saw as data, sacred data, encrypted in metaphor. A lion with wings, a bear rising on one side, a leopard with 4 heads. These were not inventions. They were keys. They were spiritual diagnostics of empires. Not merely what nations did, but what they were becoming. Babylon, proud and golden. Medo-Persia, uneven but ferocious. Greece, swift and multiplied. Rome, brutal and divided. Each metal, each beast, each number, a symbol of internal spiritual weather patterns projected outward as political dominion. And at the center of it all, one like a son of man, not emerging from the beasts, but descending from above, brought before the Ancient of Days, given dominion, glory, and an everlasting kingdom. Daniel does not name him, but he recognizes him, a figure who does not seize power, but receives it, a king not by conquest, but by inheritance. This, more than any date or image, is the true axis of Daniel's visions, that the ages are moving toward someone, not just something. A person who gathers the scattered, judges the arrogant, restores the ruined. A person who embodies the fusion of heaven and earth, time and eternity, justice and mercy. This is where all the metals bend, where the statue collapses, where the stone not cut by human hands grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. Not a new empire, a new dimension of being. Daniel does not describe it in policy or theology. He points toward it with trembling silence. A future beyond categories, a rule beyond thrones. And so his visions remain, both as a warning and as a promise. A warning that power without alignment is dust. A promise that the sacred still speaks, even in exile. That the dream of empires is fleeting, but the dreamer behind them watches still. Daniel stood not at the center of history, but at its turning. He did not change the world with armies or decrees. He changed it by seeing. And in that act of seeing, he taught the soul to wait, not passively, not with fear, but with alignment, knowing that time itself is a prophecy and we are all being watched not for punishment but for awakening. Some stories do not begin with thunder. They begin with silence, a silence so deep, so intentional, that it becomes the language of the sacred. The story of Esther is one of these. In a book where the name of God is never spoken, presence moves like breath, invisible, ungraspable, and yet undeniable. In the heart of Persia's golden court, beneath marble arches and gardens of precise geometry, a hidden revolution was unfolding, not of armies or prophets, but of a woman. She did not arrive with prophecy in her mouth or tablets in her hand. She came cloaked in anonymity, her name changed, her lineage concealed. And yet, it was through her that darkness would be turned back. Through her that an entire people would remember they were still seen. Esther is not merely a historical figure. She is an archetype, the veiled queen, the hidden vessel, the feminine dimension of divine intelligence working in secret. Where Daniel stood in visions and Cyrus wielded decrees, Esther moved within the shadows of the palace, where the holy must be whispered and faith must wear silence like a crown. Hers is not the story of public miracles. It is the miracle of timing, of presence, of discernment, the sacred intuition that arrives before the mind can understand. When Vashti, the first queen, refused to be displayed like an ornament, the empire trembled. Her absence created a space, and into that space stepped Hadassah, renamed Esther, clothed not in status but in grace. She was chosen not only for her beauty, but for something unspoken, a radiance that could not be measured, only felt. And though the king did not know it, the divine had once again placed a soul within a throne not to rule, but to redeem. The threat that emerged through Haman was not political alone, it was existential. His hatred was ancient, tribal, venomous. It carried the echo of Amalek, the sworn enemy of Israel from the days of Exodus. Haman's plot was not simply to annihilate a people, but to erase their memory from the world. And what makes Esther's response eternal is not only that she stood against it, but how she stood. She did not rush to expose. She prepared. She fasted. She listened. She moved as if led by something greater than strategy. The sacred feminine does not dominate, it invites. And in her invitation, she drew the king, the enemy, and the nation into a single room, where truth could be revealed without force. In that moment, when she finally spoke, she became more than queen. She became mirror, sword, sanctuary. If we had merely been sold into slavery, I would have kept silent, she said, not out of submission, but out of spiritual proportion. She knew the weight of what was at stake. And it was this understanding, this wisdom without arrogance, that turned the king's heart, that exposed the enemy, that saved the people. But the miracle of Esther is not only in what is done, it is in what is not said. God's name is nowhere in the text, not once, and yet he is everywhere, in the timing of the edicts, the dreams, the banquets, the pauses between decisions. It is a theology of absence that reveals a deeper kind of presence, a presence that does not need to be named to be real, a presence that moves like breath in the chest of the story, never seen, never heard, but felt in every beat. The fall of Haman was not merely the downfall of a man. It was the collapse of a structure, a spiritual architecture of hatred, deception, and ancestral resentment that had grown bold under royal favor. His execution upon the very gallows he had prepared for another was not irony. It was revelation. The mechanism of evil is often the trap it sets for others. And in the book of Esther, This law is not preached. It is embodied. Haman's rise and fall are inseparable from Esther's silence and speech. She does not confront him in the streets. She waits until the moment when both concealment and revelation meet. When the enemy is seated beside the king, when wine flows and masks have softened. It is there within that intimate twilight of empire that she turns and speaks, not in fury, but in clarity. The confrontation between light and shadow is not explosive, it is precise. The sacred does not react, it responds. The edict Haman had issued could not be revoked. Persian law knew no reversal, but could be answered. A new decree, born from the breath of revelation, permitted the Jews to defend themselves. And so the day once marked for extermination became the day of deliverance. What was written in the language of annihilation was rewritten in the grammar of defiance. A people who had been scattered, silenced, hidden, rose. But again, it is not only the historical reversal that gives this story its resonance. It is the architecture beneath it, the invisible scaffolding of divine intent, executed not by thunder or fire, but through human courage attuned to sacred timing. Esther did not part seas. She crossed thresholds. She moved through fear, through risk, through silence, and emerged as an axis between destiny and choice. In the Hermetic tradition, there is a truth whispered from teacher to student, that the highest forces do not reveal themselves with noise, but through form, through patterns, correspondences, alignments of inner and outer. Esther is one such form. Her very name, hidden, conceals the essence of her power. She is the mystery wrapped in finery, the divine presence that wears no name, yet directs the entire plot. She represents the archetype of the veiled Redeemer, the one who does not need to be seen to be real, who transforms not by overt declarations, but by stepping into the right moment. And so the book of Esther becomes more than history or festival. It becomes template, a microcosm of the cosmic struggle between darkness and light. It teaches not through law, but through motion, not through prophecy, but through intuition. And perhaps this is why the divine name is absent, because in this story, God is not the voice from the mountain or the fire in the bush. God is the pause before the word, the whisper before the decision, the quiet courage that says, if I perish, and still walks forward. This is a different kind of faith, a mature faith, one that does not need certainty to act, that trusts not in outcomes, but in presence. The feminine sacred in Esther is not passive. It is fierce in its stillness. It is the womb of strategy, the vessel of reversal. It holds the tension between concealment and revelation and teaches us that the divine does not always speak. Sometimes it listens. It waits to be invited, and when invited, it arrives in disguise, wearing no name but leaving fingerprints on every page. Esther's story ends with joy, with feasting, with a nation remembering that its survival was not random. And yet the greater victory is quieter still. It is the reminder that sometimes salvation comes not from above, but from within the court, within the risk, within the ordinary courage of one who is not supposed to matter. And in that risk, the entire course of sacred history shifts, not by sword, by presence. Before they became silhouettes in Christmas stories, before they were reduced to 3 cloaked travelers carrying symbolic gifts, the Magi were something altogether different. They were guardians of a science that modern minds have forgotten, the science of the soul's alignment with the stars, of history as a spiral of celestial influence, of time as a doorway through which the divine whispers. They were not kings. They were not merely priests. They were initiates, trained in the observation of the heavens, the interpretation of symbols, and the discipline of silence. In the courts of ancient Persia, where empires rose and fell in the shadow of greater mysteries, the Magi held a position that defied categories. They were astronomers, yes, but not of brute calculation. They studied the stars not as burning rocks in a cold sky, but as living signs, expressions of a cosmic intelligence communicating in light. To the Magi, the universe was not indifferent. It was infused with mind, and every movement of the heavens echoed some deeper movement in the world of man. Stars did not predict the future. They revealed its readiness. And it was under this wisdom, cultivated over generations and wrapped in ritual, that a certain group of them one day looked up and saw something different. A star that did not behave like others. A light that moved not with the rhythm of the sky, but with the pulse of purpose. They followed it not because they were curious, but because they recognized it. They had seen signs like this before, in scrolls, in dreams, in the remnants of prophecy handed down from the days of Daniel. For though Daniel had long since passed, his visions had not. He had left more than memories in Babylon and Persia. He had left a language, a way of reading time, of deciphering meaning within cycles, of tracing the finger of God across the heavens. The Magi had preserved that language. They had translated it into symbols, embedded it into rituals, woven it into the education of those who would become watchers of the world. Daniel, whose own life was shaped by dreams and visions, had whispered to history the mathematics of a coming one, a redeemer who would arrive not in myth, but in time. His 70 weeks, his visions of kingdoms, his glimpses of a figure like a son of man. These were not forgotten. They were studied, guarded, passed hand to hand like sacred fire. And so, when that fire lit the sky, the Magi did not hesitate. They understood. Something ancient had reached its threshold. The prophecy was not only unfolding, it was traveling, moving westward, calling to them. And so they answered, not with sermons, but with motion. Their journey was not a simple caravan. It was an initiation, a descent from the known into the unknown, from court to desert, from calculation to surrender. They crossed lands not simply for distance, but for purification, shedding the weight of empire, of intellectual certainty, of station and structure. They traveled as servants, not of a king, but of a sign. Each step was an act of faith. Each night under stars they had once named became a mirror of their own humility. They were not bringing wisdom to the child. They were coming to be transformed by him. The Magi understood that the true initiate must one day bow to the greater mystery. And this journey, written into the very stars they had studied, was that bow. They reached the threshold of Bethlehem not as men of prestige, but as seekers whose knowledge had carried them to the limits of knowing. What they found was not a palace, but a threshold in humility, a child wrapped not in gold, but in silence. And yet, to those who see with awakened sight, the silence speaks more than thunder. The infant they approached was not cloaked in celestial glory. He cried, he breathed, he blinked. But to the Magi, who had trained their whole lives to read symbols and signs, this was no ordinary birth. He was the axis, the still point in the turning of worlds. The reason the heavens had stirred, the scrolls had whispered, the star had moved, not because of the child's power, but because of his alignment. He was not simply a child of David. He was a threshold being, a convergence of prophecy and presence, of time and eternity. And in that convergence, the Magi bowed. Their gifts were not random. Gold, for the king not yet crowned. Frankincense, for the priest of a covenant not yet revealed. Myrrh, for the death he would embrace before the world understood who had walked among them. These were not offerings of wealth. They were prophetic acknowledgments that the child before them would fulfill a geometry of meaning traced long before the empires that now ruled the earth. And then they left, quietly, without applause or recognition. They departed by another route, guided again by the whispering of spirit. Their names were never recorded. Their tombs were never venerated, because their purpose was never to be remembered. It was to remember, to witness, to anchor a moment in the sacred history of the world. And they did. The story of the Magi is often flattened into symbol, but symbols, when misunderstood, become decoration. What they carried was not only treasure, but transmission. The lineage of Daniel, the fire of Zoroaster, the wisdom of Persia's ancient soul, all bowed before something greater than knowledge. The unfolding of the divine made flesh. Their journey is our inheritance, a map for the soul that still dares to follow light into darkness, signs into silence, and mystery into devotion. For in every age, the star appears, not in the sky, perhaps, but in the quiet knowing that flickers in the heart. It does not force us to move. It invites, and only those who have eyes to see will understand that the journey is not to a place, but to a posture, a surrender, a remembering that wisdom is not what we accumulate, but what we release when the holy arrives. And so the Magi passed, nameless, silent, finished, but their movement left a ripple. Their arrival marked a turning, and every soul who seeks not certainty but alignment now walks in their footsteps, watching, waiting, traveling toward the light that calls across the edges of the world and within. Not all absences are empty. Some carry the weight of intention, as if history itself were pausing mid-breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. After the drama of kings and prophets, after the voices of Daniel and Esther had fallen quiet, Persia seemed to vanish from sacred narrative. The scrolls fell silent. No new revelations bore its name. It was as though the stage had shifted, and the empire that once sheltered the exiled, liberated the temple, and preserved the wisdom of the Magi had faded behind the curtain of time. But Persia had not disappeared. It had entered the shadow, the place in spiritual history where influence no longer shouts, but whispers. And it is in that whisper that the soul of the East continued its work. Beneath the new banners of Greece and Rome, beneath the scripts of the Gospels and the letters of Paul, there still pulsed a frequency born of fire temples and star-watching towers. Zoroaster's flame had not gone out. It had simply changed its direction. The Hebrew canon grew quiet about Persia, but the soul of revelation had not forgotten. Wisdom, once guarded in palaces and spoken in riddles to kings, began to migrate, not through armies, but through minds. The esoteric traditions of the following centuries did not arise in a vacuum. They grew from a soil enriched by Persian metaphysics, by Zoroastrian cosmology, by a worldview where good and evil were not abstractions, but forces in motion, locked in a tension that mirrored the very soul of man. What Zoroaster had seen, the dual nature of existence, the war between Ahura Mazda and Ungra Mainyu, light and shadow, order and chaos, became the seed from which later esoteric systems would grow. As Greece absorbed the wisdom of the East, and Rome gathered the scattered scrolls of 1,000 traditions, the Persian soul did not resist. It diffused, willingly, into the collective memory of mystics and sages. Gnostic texts, discovered centuries later in clay jars and buried caves, speak in languages shaped by this influence. The idea of a divine spark trapped in a fallen world. The notion of a demiurge, not unlike the corrupted forces Zoroaster had warned against. The call to gnosis, to inner knowing as a path of liberation, carries with it the flame of Persian thought, now hidden under new names. The Manichaeans, born from the same soil, would carry that dualism into sharper definition. Mani, the prophet of light and shadow, walked in the footsteps of Zoroaster, reframing his cosmic vision in the language of late antiquity. To him, the world was not an accident, but a battlefield, and the human body, a place where that war was made flesh. His vision was not welcomed by empire. It was too precise, too radiant, too subversive. And so, like Persia itself, it was pushed into the margins, preserved in fragments, remembered only in echoes. Even the Neoplatonists, though they wrote in Greek and walked the halls of Alexandria and Rome, borrowed more than they confessed. Their great chain of being, their doctrine of emanations from the One, their silent contemplation of the divine, these bore the fingerprint of Eastern fire. Where Plato had speculated, the Persians had already prayed, and that prayer had traveled westward, changing its dress, but not its essence. And in the deserts of later centuries, as Islam rose and the world shifted again, the Sufis would carry forward what no empire could kill. The mystical branch of Islam did not reject Persian influence. It embodied it. The Sufi poets sang of divine love as fire, of annihilation of the self as sacred merging, of the beloved as hidden and yet more real than breath. Their whirling, their verses, their sacred longing, all of it bore the aroma of ancient Zoroastrian incense, now burned in new sanctuaries. Persia, in its silence, became the womb of esoteric memory. While history remembered conquerors and councils, Persia remembered mystery. And it is this mystery, fluid, quiet, enduring, that shaped the underground river of spiritual knowledge in the West. Not by conquest, but by infiltration. Not by the sword, but by the question, what if the world is more than what we see? What if light and darkness are not myths, but maps? Persia's retreat from biblical spotlight was not a defeat, but a strategy of spirit. Empires seek glory in stone and conquest, but the soul seeks continuity in silence. And it is often in that very silence that the truest work of heaven takes place, unrecorded, unwitnessed by scribes, yet shaping everything from the inside. As Greece burned its libraries and Rome built its roads, Persia whispered in metaphors, encoded in poetry, and preserved its flame not in capitals, but in consciousness. This is how the sacred survives, not by force, but by essence. The Zoroastrian idea that good and evil are not illusions, but forces, that the human soul is an active participant in the outcome of cosmic balance, gave rise to a worldview where the spiritual was not an escape from the world, but a responsibility within it. And this responsibility echoed, again and again, through the great mystical traditions that followed. By the time the Gnostics gathered in their secret circles, the Persian voice had already shaped their cosmology. The idea of a fallen world, a divine spark trapped in flesh, and a liberator descending from a realm of pure light did not emerge in a vacuum. These were resonances of something older, refracted, reworded, and hidden beneath Greek syntax, but bearing unmistakably the fingerprint of a fire religion born between mountain and desert. The Manichaeans, too, bore this light. Mani, who called himself the seal of the prophets, was not inventing a system, but reweaving an ancient one. His dualistic cosmology, radical in its clarity, poetic in its reach, did not fit easily within the boundaries of empire or orthodoxy. He was persecuted, his scriptures scattered, his followers hunted. Yet the ideas lived on, migrating underground, finding refuge in Sufi allegories, in Kathar's simplicity, even in the cautious metaphysics of later Christian mystics. Neoplatonism, though outwardly Platonic, carried the same fire in different form. Plotinus did not speak the language of Zoroaster, but he echoed his intuitions. The one, the emanation of realities, the return of the soul through purification. These mirrored the journey through Asha and Dir Uj, the Zoroastrian tension between truth and distortion. The mystic ascent was now intellectualized, but its bones were Persian. The longing for return, for union, for the collapse of multiplicity into unity came not only from Athens but from ancient Iran, translated by silence into the heart of the Mediterranean. And so, when Islam arose, Persia could have disappeared completely into the maw of conquest, but it didn't. Instead, it reshaped Islam from within. The language may have become Arabic, but the mystic fire remained Persian. It burned in Rumi's verses, in Attar's valleys, in Hafez's riddles. It danced in the turning of dervishes and glowed in the silence of Sufi meditation. The Zoroastrian cosmology of light and shadow, already refined through centuries of esoteric preservation, found new expression in Islamic mysticism, not as doctrine, but as experience. God was no longer only law. He became the beloved, the hidden, the fire behind the veil. This is the destiny of Persia, not to dominate the stage, but to sustain the soul. While history shifts its focus to Rome, to Jerusalem, to Byzantium, Persia remains in the periphery, like a star only visible when you do not look at it directly. Its wisdom flows beneath the surface of traditions that have forgotten their source. Its fire lives in the metaphors of those who never heard Zoroaster's name, but walk his path unknowingly. It is the great silence that holds the memory of the sacred while the world speaks too loudly to listen. And this silence is not passive. It is active, a womb, a forge, a crucible. It transforms by waiting. It teaches not by proclamation, but by reflection. Persia's legacy is not a doctrine to be memorized, but a question to be carried. What part of the light still hides in your shadow? What ancient flame still burns beneath the surface of your faith, your doubt, your longing? For the empires pass, the theologies shift, the languages die, but the soul remembers. And somewhere, beneath all systems and symbols, the sacred still speaks in the Persian tongue of mystery, of fire, of return. There are visions in Scripture that do not settle into the past. They remain restless. They breathe under the surface of headlines and homilies, waiting not for interpretation, but for alignment. Among them, the prophecy of Gog and Magog, inscribed in the cryptic scrolls of Ezekiel, stands like a riddle cast across time, unsettling, magnetic, and uncannily present. Ezekiel, the priest-prophet of exile, saw more than restoration. He saw a return, not just of people, but of conflict. In chapters 38 and 39, a shadow rises from the north, cloaked in names half-remembered and allegiances barely understood. Gog, of the land of Magog, leads an alliance of nations against Israel, a nation regathered from exile, dwelling in apparent peace, unaware that the final storm is already assembling at its gates. Among the nations listed, Persia, not as footnote, as key player. This is no coincidence. In the cosmic script, no actor returns to the stage without purpose. The mention of Persia in this apocalyptic tableau is not a repetition of history. It is a continuation of a sacred pattern. The same land that once sheltered the exiles now reappears as part of a coalition against them. How can this be? How can the land of Cyrus become the weapon of Gog? The answer is not in politics, but in archetype. Sacred history does not move in lines, but in spirals. Persia's appearance in Ezekiel's vision is not simply geopolitical foresight. It is an invitation to see beyond surface conflict, into the mythic layer where nations are not merely nations, but carriers of energy, of influence, of ancestral karma. The Persia of Ezekiel is not only geographic. It is symbolic, a soul force that once aligned with light, now drifting into shadow, summoned into alignment not by will, but by spiritual inertia. This is the haunting genius of prophetic scripture. It speaks to its moment, and yet transcends it. The Gog and Magog prophecy has been applied to many eras: Scythians, Mongols, Soviets, and now, increasingly, to Iran and its alliances. But beneath every literal attempt lies the unchanging architecture of eschatology, a final gathering, a great deception, a storm of nations, and an intervention not of armies, but of the divine. Modern Iran, heir to the legacy of ancient Persia, walks a narrow path, pulled between the memory of Zoroaster and the fire of fundamentalism, between poetry and militancy, between being a guardian of mystery and a provocateur of war. And in this contradiction, the echo of Ezekiel grows louder, not because the prophecy demands fulfillment, but because humanity continues the script it refuses to rewrite. It is not merely Iran's foreign policy that makes Ezekiel's words feel close. It is the spiritual atmosphere, a confluence of alliances, ideologies, and ancestral tensions aligning once again against the small, luminous thread that is Israel. And yet, Ezekiel is clear: the battle is not the end. It is the reckoning, a moment in which masks fall and the true forces behind empires are exposed. Gog is not a man. Gog is a spirit, a collective force, a congealed will toward domination, deception, and destruction. Magog is its host, the amalgam of systems that choose power over truth. When Persia, or any nation, allies with this force, it is not condemned by geography, but by alignment. The prophecy does not curse bloodlines. It reveals patterns of choice that resurface when the spiritual field is neglected. The war that Ezekiel foresaw is not one to be fought with swords alone, or missiles, or tanks. It is fought in realms invisible, beneath the clamor of alliances and borders. Its true weapons are narratives, identities, fears, and its terrain is the human heart, the collective will of nations bent toward either harmony or domination. When Persia appears again in such a vision, it is not merely because of geography. It is because of its ancient role as a pivot point between forces, a land that has always stood at the threshold between light and shadow. To those with eyes to see, this war is never only about nations. It is about spiritual configurations. The coalition in Ezekiel's vision is not just geopolitical, it is existential. It is the final rising of that which resists divine order, that which cannot bow to something higher than its own ambition. Gog is the archetype of the anti-sacred empire, the final mask of human pride cloaked in moral justification. And yet, Ezekiel's vision is not one of despair. Though the storm gathers, though the nations conspire, the end is not devastation. It is revelation. Fire falls from heaven not only to destroy, but to reveal the true nature of what has risen. The weapons that men forge become useless in the face of what descends. The alliance of rebellion collapses not under military defeat, but under the weight of its own falseness. It is not Israel that wins. It is the truth that cannot be buried. Modern interpreters often reduce such prophecies to political speculation, anxious to map every name to a headline. every trumpet to a war. But prophecy is not journalism. It is divine patterning, language woven in symbols meant to awaken the soul. When Ezekiel named Persia among Gog's allies, he was not condemning a people. He was illuminating a possibility that even the most enlightened civilizations can fall if they forget who they are. Iran today is not Gog, but it stands at crossroads. It bears within itself the memory of Cyrus and the fire of Zoroaster, the poetry of Rumi and the devotion of the mystics. Yet is also pulled by powers that seek to align it with darker tides, ideologies built not on wisdom, but on control. This tension is not only national, it is deeply human. For each of us carries within the same crossroad, the path of Cyrus or the path of Gog. In this sense, the prophecy of Ezekiel is not only about the future, it is about discernment in the present. Who do we ally with? Not in politics, but in spirit. What alliances have we made in thought, in desire, in belief, that place us in opposition to truth? Gog and Magog rise not because of prophecy alone, but because humanity forgets the lessons it once knew. When Persia sheltered the exiled and honored the divine, it was aligned with heaven. When it raises its hand against that light, it participates in its own undoing. Yet always, there is a chance to return. This is the mystery that echoes beneath the dread of apocalyptic scripture, the invitation embedded within the warning. Prophecy does not speak to destroy, but to redirect. Even the darkest visions are laced with light, for their purpose is not terror, but awakening. The war of Gog and Magog is not inevitable. It is conditional, contingent upon the choices of nations, and deeper still, upon the choices of souls. And so, the judgment of Persia is not final. It is open-ended. It is a call to remember its own sacred past, to reclaim the fire of the Magi, the justice of Cyrus, the songs of the Sufi. It is a mirror held up to the world, asking not just what will happen, but who will we choose to become? Because in every generation, Gog stirs. And in every generation, Persia must choose again, to be a shield of sanctuary or a sword of unrest. One leads to silence, the other to song. And still, the scroll of Ezekiel remains open, as if waiting. There are verses in sacred texts that seem almost to hide themselves, not by accident, but as if waiting for the right moment to be seen. Among the thunder of famous prophecies, the name Elam barely echoes. Yet in the soft light of Jeremiah 49, tucked within the judgments pronounced upon ancient nations, there lies a whisper that breaks the rhythm of destruction. It is not a warning alone. It is a promise. For I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might. Yet it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, declares the Lord. And with that phrase, I will bring again, something ancient stirs beneath the rubble of empires. Elam was one of the firstborn regions after the flood, a land of the east, descendant of Shem, brother to Assyria and ancestor to Persia. It stood between mountains and rivers, between Eden's memory and Babylon's ambition. And yet it remained largely silent, almost peripheral, as the drama of Scripture unfolded. Until here, until Jeremiah, until the moment where, in the midst of divine judgment, Elam is named, not merely to fall, but to rise again. This is the rhythm often overlooked in the prophetic voice, judgment followed by restoration, not as contradiction, but as completion. For the nature of divine justice is not finality, but transformation. And Elam, as a symbol, bears this truth. Its bow is broken, its military might, its pride, its earthly power. But its exile is not eternal. Its story is not closed. The final word is not ruin, but return. In the great cycle of sacred history, Elam stands as a symbol of those peoples and souls who, though judged, are not rejected, who fall but are not forgotten, who are scattered but not lost. This echoes the divine architecture revealed in many traditions, including the cosmology of Urantia, which speaks of progress through the spiral of fall and illumination, of universes evolving not through perfection alone, but through the tension between ignorance and awakening. The prophecy over Elam becomes a sacred mirror. It reveals a God who sees the whole arc, not only the rebellion, but the redemption. It affirms that judgment is not vengeance, but preparation. That exile is not abandonment, but invitation to transformation, to reorientation, to the remembering of what was forgotten. And here, Elam becomes more than a place. It becomes an archetype. The Elam in us is that which once stood proud, then shattered. That part of us that wandered too far, trusted too much in strength, and lost the way. But also the part for whom restoration is still possible. If we can hear the whisper beneath the judgment, you are not finished. This theme of restoration following collapse is not isolated to Jeremiah. It runs through the ancient scrolls like a hidden current. It appears in the return from Babylon, in the resurrection after crucifixion, in the healing of the nations in Revelation. Even in the philosophies of the East, this spiral is known. In Taoism, the fall is not the end, but the fertile beginning of return. In the Upanishads, the soul journeys through cycles of forgetting and remembering, always carried by the breath of the eternal toward reunion. And in Urantia, even the Lucifer rebellion, though catastrophic, is not the end of the fallen worlds, but their deep school of spiritual evolution. Elam, then, is the key to a larger principle, that the divine does not abandon its seeds, no matter how far they scatter. The bough may be broken, but the root is still alive. Restoration, in sacred logic, is never a return to what was. It is an elevation into what could be. It is not nostalgia, but transformation. Elam is not restored simply to regain its might, but to fulfill a purpose it once forgot. In Jeremiah's vision, the exile becomes the womb, the breaking becomes the blessing, and this principle of judgment that gives way to mercy, of collapse that opens to light, runs through the entire architecture of divine revelation. The soul of Elam, like the soul of every people, is not static. It is dynamic, evolving not only through instruction, but through experience. Even its rebellion becomes part of its curriculum. This is the echo that vibrates not just through Jeremiah, but through the cosmology of the Urantia Book. In its pages, the universe is not a perfect mechanism, but a living story, composed of beings who learn by trial, who ascend by failure, who grow through the long journey of returning to the center they once left. Urantia's revelation does not shy away from the reality of error. It reveals that even the Lucifer rebellion, the most devastating rupture in the celestial hierarchy, does not nullify the potential of redemption. Whole worlds may fall into spiritual confusion, but the divine response is never annihilation, it is patience. It is the dispatching of teachers, of truth, of love incarnate, again and again, until the sleeping souls begin to stir. Until Elam remembers. This is not optimism. It is the logic of divine love. A love that does not depend on worthiness, but on origin. That which was born of the light cannot be forgotten by the light. The prophecy of Elam, then, becomes the secret line in every judgment, the clause at the bottom of every divine decree. This is not the end. In every sacred tradition, this truth is veiled in different garments. In Judaism, The Day of Atonement ends not with punishment, but with reconciliation. In Christianity, the cross becomes the gate of resurrection. In Islam, every name of God that speaks of wrath is paired with one that speaks of mercy. And in Zoroastrianism, even Ahriman, the force of darkness is not eternal. The great renewal, frashokaridi, will come, and light will embrace all that was fractured. What, then, does this mean for us? It means the story we believe about history, about nations, about ourselves, must include the possibility of return. It means that no fall is too deep, no exile too far, no Elam too forgotten for the divine to still call it by name. It means that beneath every judgment, there is a seed, and if we tend it with humility, it will grow into something we could not have imagined. And so Elam becomes a symbol not only of Persia's forgotten destiny, but of the human soul's resilience. The prophecy does not erase the pain, it transfigures it. It dares to declare that destruction is never the last note in God's song. That grace is written into the foundation of the universe, not as escape, but as restoration through evolution. We do not return as we were. We return as who we have become, shaped by fire, softened by failure, luminous with a wisdom that only loss can teach. This is the hidden meaning of Jeremiah's oracle. This is the soul of the chapter the world forgot. And still today, in every moment of silence, a voice speaks what Elam once heard in the dark. You are not finished. You're not cast off. You are called. The bow is broken, but the promise remains. There are philosophies that speak in propositions, and there are philosophies that breathe, quiet rivers of thought flowing beneath history's surface, shaping civilizations without raising a sound. Persian philosophy belongs to this second kind, not always visible, often unspoken, yet its presence lingers in poetry, in mysticism, in the questions that refuse to die. What is light? What is soul? What is time? In ancient Persia, to speak of the world was never merely to describe matter. It was to evoke a living order, radiant with meaning. Zoroaster's vision was not of a world governed by blind mechanics, but by light, asha, truth, order, and luminous intention. Light was not simply a substance. It was a principle, the sacred thread that stitched being together, the divine law that moved through stars and thoughts alike. To align with the light was to live rightly. To oppose it was to fall into the shadow, not as punishment, but as distance from one's own origin. Centuries later, in a world both collapsing and converging, another voice whispered this same idea in a different tone. The Corpus Hermeticum, born in the twilight of Alexandria, carries a resonance strangely familiar to Persian ears. In it, the Logos is not merely speech, but a cosmic intelligence, a living bridge between the ineffable one and the manifest many. The soul, says Hermes Trismegistus, descends through the spheres, forgetting itself, and must remember through ascent, through the inner eye, through gnosis. And again, the metaphor is light. Persia and Hermetism, though distant in geography and chronology, meet in this shared intuition that the soul is not fully at home in the world of forms, and yet it must pass through them. That knowledge is not accumulation, but remembrance. That light is not a metaphor. It is the language of being. In both traditions, time is not a flat line, but a spiral. In Zoroastrianism, time, Zervin, is the father of the duality, the framework within which the drama of light and dark unfolds, not as eternal conflict, but as temporary tension destined to be reconciled. In Hermeticism, time is the theater of the soul's forgetting and return. It is sacred interval, not mere duration. the womb in which the soul reawakens to its divine origin. This metaphysics of light and time finds deep harmony with the teachings of the Urantia Book. There, too, the cosmos is not static, but a living organism where mind, spirit, and matter interlace with mathematical elegance and spiritual intention. The soul is not a ghost trapped in a body, nor a flicker of chance. It is a midway creature, a child of mind and spirit, tasked with choosing its alignment in the face of a meaningful universe. Urantia reveals that personality, the divine gift from the Universal Father, is the constant through which the soul weaves its evolution. Like Zoroaster's Righteous One or Hermes' Initiate, the human being is a threshold creature, bound to time, yet drawn toward eternity, limited in perception, yet capable of divine insight. The soul grows not merely through experience, but through decision, the sacred act of aligning with the higher again and again across the dust and stars. This is the shared wisdom beneath the forms. Whether clothed in Persian fire or Hermetic symbols, the teaching is one. The universe is intelligible because it is alive, and the human being is not alien to its heart, but invited to awaken within it. To walk between two worlds is not to be divided. It is to become the bridge itself. In the Persian tradition, this task was entrusted to the soul, a luminous being cloaked in matter, tasked with remembering its origin while honoring its passage through the visible. Zoroastrian texts speak of the Irvin, the individual soul, as both participant and witness, as judge of its own deeds and seed of its own destiny. It must walk the Chinvat bridge, the bridge of separation after death, where its weight is not its body, but its choices. Yet even this judgment is not condemnation. It is clarity, the unveiling of who we have become. Hermetic wisdom echoes this journey in other words. The Poimandras describes the soul as descending through the planetary spheres, absorbing impressions and forgetfulness until it reaches embodiment. There, in the density of form, it lives a life that may deepen the illusion or break it. When death comes, if the soul has remembered itself, it ascends again, shedding the planetary garments one by one, returning to the divine source. The path upward is not an escape from the world, but a victory over ignorance. The visible is not to be denied. It is to be transcended through understanding. The Urantia teachings confirm and refine this ancient intuition. They declare that the soul is not pre-existent, but emergent, the result of the sacred interplay between mortal mind and divine spirit. When a human being begins to choose truth, beauty, and goodness, even without full understanding, the soul is born, not as a concept, but as an immortal reality. This soul is nurtured by the thought adjuster, the indwelling fragment of God, which does not control, but gently guides, respecting every nuance of freedom. The visible and the invisible are not enemies in this cosmology. They are stages of becoming, and the soul is the traveler, learning how to shine through the mud, how to sing in the silence. The Persian and Hermetic paths taught that gnosis, true knowledge, is not learned, but remembered. Not because the fact were forgotten, but because the essence was buried. The same is true in Urantia. The divine does not demand belief. It invites recognition. The mind may be trained, but the soul must be awakened. And that awakening is always inward first, before it ever takes form in action or doctrine. Thus, the human being stands in sacred tension, feet in the world, eyes toward eternity. The logos, whether in Persian fire temples or Hermetic scrolls, or in the person of Christ as revealed in Urantia, is always the bridge, the mediator, the lifeline, the luminous thread pulling us toward the real. We are not expected to know all, but we are invited to seek. We are not demanded to perfect ourselves, but to align, to listen, to love. In this grand confluence of traditions, Persian, Hermetic, and Urantian, we find not contradiction, but confirmation. Different words, same fire. Different metaphors, same longing. Different visions, same center. And perhaps this is the hidden wisdom of Persia, not merely that she built empires or liberated captives, but that she remembered, at least for a time, that the soul is not a prisoner of flesh, nor a ghost of the mind, but a living flame born between two worlds, destined to return through the journey of light. To read the Book of Urantia is to widen the lens through which history is seen. What once appeared as a random patchwork of wars, prophets, empires, and collapses is redefined as the unfolding of a deeper architecture, the patient administration of celestial intention across time. Earth, known in the universe registry as Urantia, is not just a sphere of life. It is a laboratory of souls, a contested yet chosen stage upon which spirit and matter continually meet. Unlike other inhabited worlds, Urantia bears the marks of great interruption. It is a planet marred by rebellion, divergence, and delayed progression. Its evolution, though guided, has been complicated by cosmic error, not least the Caligastia betrayal and the ramifications of Lucifer's insurrection. And yet, despite these disruptions, or perhaps because of them, Urantia became the recipient of extraordinary attention. Special missions, unique incarnations, divine visitations tailored to restore equilibrium and redirect its trajectory toward light. Among these missions, 3 stand out like luminous pillars: the Melchizedek emissaries, the avonal visitation of Mashaventa Melchizedek, and the culminating bestowal mission of Michael of Nebadon, known on earth as Jesus of Nazareth. Each of these interventions marks a sacred turning point, not just in theology or culture, but in the very soul of civilization. And like constellations recurring in the spiritual sky, they point towards something deliberate, something watched. Within this cosmic narrative, Persia emerges not merely as a geographic location, but as an energetic intersection, a meeting place of light and shadow, a land prepared again and again to host contact, resistance, awakening, and forgetting. When Mashaventa Melchizedek incarnated in the time of Abraham, his influence radiated eastward as well as westward, establishing a spiritual framework that, generations later, would echo in the dualism of Zoroastrianism. The very notion of a righteous path, a moral struggle between truth and deceit, and a judgment to come bears the fingerprints of Melchizedek's original teachings. Persia, in this reading, becomes more than a kingdom. It becomes a resonant field where celestial frequencies sought fertile ground. And yet, as with many places on Urantia, the reception of light was never simple. The seeds of revelation sown by the divine were often buried beneath centuries of priestly control, political power, or philosophical drift. The result was not destruction, but distortion, a sacred memory blurred, not erased. Urantia teaches that planetary evolution unfolds in stages: biological, cultural, moral, and eventually spiritual. Each stage is shepherded by invisible beings, whose work is largely unknown, yet foundational. The planetary prince, the material sons, the Melchizedeks, and the magisterial sons all play roles in shaping the planetary destiny. Yet because of rebellion, Urantia walked a lonelier path, and this loneliness invited a greater intimacy. Earth became the theater for Michael's own bestowal, the very creator of this local universe choosing to walk its soil, not in celestial grandeur, but as a man, to know death, to know limitation, to speak from within. And in this context, the nations of Urantia become more than political boundaries. They are spiritual organisms, collective expressions of humanity's inner condition. Some nations rise with a purpose, serve their cycle, and fade. Others persist in shadow, their time not yet ripe. A few become pivot points, reflective surfaces for celestial work. Persia is one of these. If the human eye sees only the surface of nations, the celestial eye perceives their deeper currents, the karmic tides, ancestral memories, and archetypal roles each civilization plays in the grand mosaic. In the symphony of Urantia's evolution, Persia plays a hauntingly beautiful theme, neither purely of light nor of darkness, but modulation between the two. It is a nation that receives and forgets, illuminates and veils, rises as a flame and sleeps as an ember, only to rise again. This is not failure. It is the very texture of planetary growth, the pattern of spiritual respiration. The Book of Urantia does not exalt one people above another in permanence, but rather shows how responsibility rotates, how spiritual light migrates across cultures, and how even a nation that once bore the torch may, in time, pass it or fumble it, or hide it under fear and pride. But always, in every cycle, the divine watches. The administrators of time, beings whose consciousness spans epochs, adjust, seed, wait, and realign. Persia, then, is not chosen once. It is visited repeatedly, because within its soul is a tension the universe recognizes: devotion and rebellion, mysticism and empire, humility and pride. These are not contradictions. They are the alchemical ingredients of transformation. The symbolic language that threads through Urantia's revelation is not meant to be literalized, but lived. Mountains become signs of ascent, deserts of purification, rivers of spiritual current. Time is no longer linear. It spirals, offering opportunities not only to civilizations, but to individual souls who walk those lands. And within this spiral, nations like Persia serve as mirrors, not because they are perfect, but because they reflect the deeper drama of the planetary soul. The fall of Babylon, the rise of Cyrus, the silence of Sufis, the fire of revolution, all speak a symbolic tongue the watchers understand. Cycles govern not only biology and geology, but consciousness. Each dispensation, as Urantia calls them, brings a recalibration of divine human contact, from the biological uplift of the Adamic epoch to the spiritual awakening sown by Melchizedek, to the moral integration embodied in Christ Michael. These aren't merely theological events. They are infusions of light, epochs where the veil thins, and a people or planet is invited to take a collective step toward wholeness. Some do, some resist, most do both. In this celestial context, Persia's dual role becomes clearer. It is both a recipient of revelation and a resistor of it, a spiritual liminal space where divine messages arrive clothed in flames, but often must be translated, sometimes distorted by the hands of men. And yet, the record remains. The words of Zoroaster, the visions of Daniel, the silence of Esther, the wisdom of Rumi, the calculations of Avicenna, the ecstasies of Hafiz, all of them float like constellations above the Persian sky, waiting to be remembered, not just by Iranians, but by the world. Because the spiritual destiny of a nation is never its own. It ripples outward. It plants seeds in languages and lands it never touched. And so the celestial missions, as described in the Urantia Book, continue, not only as past events, but as ongoing presences. The divine administration does not abandon a world for its errors, but draws closer through them. The angels of the planetary government, the thought adjusters within each individual, the Most Highs who rule in the kingdoms of men, they continue their unseen work. In Persia, as in all nations, the spiritual field is never dormant, even when the political landscape seems barren. To read history without this lens is to read the bark and miss the tree. But to read it through Urantia's vision is to understand that no people is forgotten and no soul is overlooked. Each carries a fragment of the eternal, a thread in the cosmic fabric, a note in the celestial harmony. And Persia, for all her contradictions, sings a note that resonates in every age. The Book of Urantia is not merely a book. It is a cartography of consciousness, a symphonic explanation of why suffering is permitted, why delay is endured, why intervention is rare and yet always sufficient. And Persia's path across its pages, from Madai and Elam to Magi and mystics, is neither random nor rigid. It is a dance of potential, a living scripture still unfolding. Perhaps that is the highest truth we can draw from this, that the divine is not finished with any of us, that the story of Urantia is not bound to the past, but is being written still in every choice made in silence, in every act of compassion across borders, in every soul that, remembering its divine origin, begins to walk again toward the light. If every individual is a soul in formation, choosing its alignment in the vast unfolding of cosmic reality, then what of nations? What of the great collectives, bound not only by language or soil, but by shared memories, traumas, visions, and longing? Could it be that nations, too, have souls, subtle bodies of consciousness shaped over centuries, infused with purpose, bearing wounds, whispering dreams? Ancient traditions believed this to be true. In the Vedas, there is the notion of Ra, not merely a kingdom, but a sacred domain under Dharma, a space entrusted with a spiritual responsibility. In Taoist philosophy, the health of a kingdom was seen as the reflection of its harmony with the Tao, the way that binds heaven and earth. And in the Hebrew prophets, nations are not mere geopolitical entities, but moral agents subject to divine counsel, judgment, and redemption. The Urantia Book elevates this vision further. While it centers on the soul's journey, it also acknowledges the invisible hands that govern in the kingdoms of men, implying that civilizations, like individuals, are participants in a broader, sacred evolution. Each nation, then, is not simply a product of politics or conquest. It is a vessel, shaped, emptied, refilled, in service of the long arc of planetary enlightenment. Some serve for a time as torches, others as mirrors, others still as witnesses. But none are forgotten. Just as individual souls go through cycles of darkness and clarity, so too do cultures. The errors of a nation do not negate its destiny. And the greatness of a civilization is not its power, but its ability to receive, preserve, and transmit the light it was given. Persia, in this grand map, stands both as participant and symbol. She is not merely herself. She reflects humanity at large, full of contradictions, capable of revelation and repression, longing for transcendence while often caught in the web of ego and empire. The same land that once birthed mystics, prophets, and celestial wisdom has also hosted tyranny and forgetfulness. And yet, this fluctuation is not unique to Persia. It is the story of the world. It is the rhythm of the human race. The great spiritual traditions, from the chants of the Upanishads to the fire hymns of Zoroaster, from the path of the Tao to the cry of the psalmist, from the silence of the Sufi to the discourse of Christ, all emerged not in isolation, but in response. They were the soul of a people speaking back to the divine, reaching for meaning in the face of mystery. None are final. All are chapters in a book still being written. Urantia offers a framework for understanding this progression. Revelation is progressive, never complete, tailored to the time, the readiness, the language, the hunger of a people. What India received as cosmic dance, what China knew as balance, what Israel heard as commandment, what Persia embodied as dual flame, and what the world saw in Jesus as embodied love. All of these are not contradictions, but facets of the same jewel, refracted through culture, time, and soul. To see religions as rivals is to misunderstand revelation itself. The divine speaks in tongues, and each people has been addressed according to its capacity to hear. The Tao that cannot be spoken, the Brahman that transcends form, the Elohim who calls from the fire, the Allah of unity, the universal father of Urantia. These are not competing deities, but veils around the one source, revealed in partial light, so that finite beings might approach. And within this choir of nations, Persia sings a tone that resonates across epochs, not because she has been constant, but because she has been deeply human. Her wisdom has echoed east and west. Her mystics have whispered truths that defy dogma. Her pain has mirrored the planetary struggle, and her longing remains. In her story, we find the story of the world. Exile and return, fall and ascent, silence and song. If nations carry souls, then they also carry wounds, collective traumas buried not just in memory, but in the energetic field of the land, the myths repeated, the songs sung in exile, the silences held during occupation. And just as a person cannot heal until they remember who they are beyond pain, so too must civilizations reconnect with the luminous seed planted in their spiritual origin. Revelation, then, is not only something given from above, it is something awakened from within. In the Upanishads, there is a teaching that the self, though covered by ignorance, remains untouched, pure, luminous, eternal. In Taoism, the way may be obscured, but it is never broken. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God, is said to be in exile with the people, waiting to be reunited through acts of remembrance. Christianity proclaims a kingdom not of this world, yet revealed within. Sufism speaks of the beloved hiding in plain sight. And the Urantia teachings remind us that even the most disrupted of worlds can become the most blessed, not despite their pain, but through it. Each tradition contributes a language, a color, a metaphor. Each nation holds a piece of the original fire. None possess it alone. Together, they form a mandala of striving. Imperfect, beautiful, broken, whole. And at the center of this mandala is the mystery of choice. Nations like souls can choose to bless or to curse, to remember or to forget, to be a vessel or a wall. And yet the divine never ceases to call. Persia's legacy, viewed not through nationalism but through the lens of spiritual architecture, is that of a nation whose inner terrain remains charged. No matter how far its outer structures may drift from their origin, the spiritual voltage of its soil remains. The prophets walked there. The stars were read there. The kings released slaves there. And somewhere in the dust of forgotten temples, the questions of existence were whispered in forms the world still deciphers. The soul of Persia, then, is not ancient. It is timeless. It lives in the hunger for transcendence, in the poetry of longing, in the unquenchable thirst for what is real behind appearances. Her mystics wrote of wine, but they meant union. They sang of love, but they meant return. They wandered deserts, but they were mapping the soul's interior. In every Sufi verse, in every fire temple's glow, in every moment where a seeker chooses surrender over control, Persia speaks again. To see her, and to see the world through Urantia's lens, is to understand that we are not here by accident. No people is randomly placed. No epic is wasted. Every culture, every path, every fragment of truth points toward the whole. And that whole is not yet visible. It is being built word by word, soul by soul, generation by generation. We are, all of us, part of a living revelation, still unfolding in mystery. And perhaps this is the greatest paradox, that as we seek to understand the soul of nations, we are called back to our own. For the same forces that guide civilizations also dwell within. The battle between forgetfulness and remembrance, between fear and surrender, between illusion and light. These are not only geopolitical. They are personal, intimate, sacred. The world is not outside of us. It is us. And to heal it, we must first recognize ourselves as part of its becoming. In the end, to speak of the soul of Persia is to speak of the soul of the world. And to speak of the world is to speak of the one, the hidden fire, the silent music, the eternal thread. It is still being woven, and it has found its way here, to these words, to this moment, to you. There's a moment in every exile when the silence becomes unbearable, when the soul, whether of a person or of a people, begins to remember what it once was. This remembrance is not triggered by logic or law, but by something older than language, an ache, a trembling, a hunger for the presence that once walked with us. The sacred does not shout. It waits, and when we are ready, it returns, not to accuse, but to embrace. Nations, like individuals, can lose their way. They can fall under the weight of pride, violence, forgetfulness. They can drift so far from their divine origin that even their sacred texts become foreign and their prophets become inconvenient memories. But still, the light remains. Hidden beneath centuries of debris, it pulses, not as nostalgia, but as invitation. It calls not to restore the past, but to fulfill the original purpose that was always embedded in the nation's soul. The path of return is not paved with conquest or ideology. It is walked in humility, in scripture and in silence, in the trembling recognition that one does not ascend by force, but by surrender. The Hebrew prophets spoke often of this, not as political strategy, but as spiritual law. The moment a people bowed, remembered, wept, the gates of restoration opened. Not because they earned it, but because they ceased resisting the one who had never left. The Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, is the symbol of this restoration. In ancient Israel, it was a time to dwell in fragile shelters, to remember the journey through the wilderness, to celebrate the presence of God not in temples of stone, but in the impermanence of the human heart. It was not about perfection, it was about presence. And the prophets spoke of a future Sukkot, one that would not be limited to Israel alone, but would draw all nations to Jerusalem, not for domination, but for reunion. This vision, found in Zechariah, is radical. The survivors of the great conflicts, the ones who remained, would ascend together in pilgrimage, offering worship not out of fear but gratitude. This image, nations walking together toward the sacred, is not a fantasy. It is the deepest dream of humanity's collective heart. And in the cosmic context offered by the Urantia Book, it is not only a dream, but a destiny. The planetary evolution of consciousness is not linear, but spiral. It includes falls, dark nights, exiles. But it also includes awakenings, moments when an entire people turns slowly toward the light they thought was lost. Not all at once, not through miracles, but through the quiet reemergence of longing, poetry, truth. The return of a nation to the sacred is never orchestrated by the powerful. It begins with the forgotten, with women at wells, children in exile, poets in the wilderness, mystics in silence. It begins when a song is sung again in the native tongue, when a scripture is read not for law, but for love, when a stranger is fed not for reward, but for joy. These are the signs. These are the tabernacles. And when enough of them rise from the dust, the nation stands again, not as an empire, but as a vessel. Persia, ancient, fractured, luminous, carries this promise too, not because she was always faithful, but because she was always chosen, not in the narrow sense of divine favoritism, but in the wider truth that every people has a role in the great unveiling. Persia's role has been fire, wisdom, vision, and, yes, sometimes pride and violence. But the journey is not over. The light is not done with her. And as the nations rise to ascend the sacred mountain, Persia will be there, not in dominance, but in song. When prophets speak of what remains after the storm, they do not describe ruins. They describe a remnant, not of structures, but of hearts. Those who survived not because they were stronger, but because they were emptied. They were stripped of certainties, purged of pride, refined by fire. And now, in their nakedness, they are ready to climb the holy mountain, not to build new towers of Babel, but to dwell once more in tents of awe. The book of Zechariah tells of such a time. After the great shaking, the nations that remain do not gather armies, but offerings. They do not impose creeds, but join in celebration. Year after year, they ascend to Jerusalem, not merely the city on a hill, but the symbol of divine convergence, where heaven and earth touch, where the names of God spoken in every tongue become one breath. The Feast of Tabernacles becomes not just a Jewish festival, but a planetary embrace, the restoration not of a religion, but of relationship. And it is here, in this mystical vision, that we glimpse the full arc of Urantia's hope. For all its complexity and cosmology, for all the revelators and hierarchies and timelines, its message is ultimately simple. No fall is final. No separation is eternal. Evolution is slow, but certain. And what matters most is not the speed of the journey, but the direction of the soul. The same law applies to a planet as to a person, to a nation as to a single child. Redemption, then, is not reversal. It is transformation. It is not about going back to what was, but about becoming what was always possible. Persia will not return to a golden age. She will awaken into a future that honors her eternal essence. Israel will not restore an empire. She will become a song that draws the world home. The nations that once warred may yet kneel beside one another, not because they forget history, but because they have learned from it. Humility is the key, is the gate through which every soul, every people, every civilization must pass. Without it, there is no true ascent. With it, even the most broken can rise. Even those who curse the light can become its carriers. Even those who were scattered can become seed. And in this final act, in this sacred convergence, we see what was always promised, that the last shall be first, and the forgotten shall become flame. This is not mythology. It is the deep logic of the soul, the eternal rhythm of divine mercy. The God of the tabernacle does not dwell in mansions. He walks among tents. He is found in the ruins, in the rebuilding, in the quiet song rising from a nation that thought it had been forsaken. And when such a song rises from Persia, from Africa, from the isles, from the ends of the earth, heaven listens, and it joins in. Thus, the return to the sacred is not a single event, nor a final destination. It is the eternal turning of the soul toward what it already knows to be true, a turning that begins in silence, that moves through story, that manifests in justice, that overflows in worship, and that finally brings the soul, whether of a person or a people, home. Time does not pass. It circles. It breathes. It weaves the forgotten into the remembered, the broken into the beautiful, the scattered into the sacred. That which we thought lost is never truly gone. It becomes soil, and from soil, the unseen grows. The story of a nation is never just its politics, its borders, its kings and wars. It is the breath of its prophets, the yearning of its mothers, the songs sung under stars. It is the silence after destruction, the courage to plant again, the whisper that something holy still lingers beneath the dust. Iran, ancient Persia, is not a chapter closed. It is a soul in motion, and so are we. The sacred does not demand perfection. It seeks participation. It calls not to the pure, but to the willing. It speaks not in thunder, but in the trembling of conscience, the stirring of memory, the quiet fire that won't be extinguished. The return to the sacred is not a grand arrival. It is the daily choice to remember what matters, to forgive what wounded, to offer what remains. In the ancient Zoroastrian texts, it is said that every soul must cross the bridge of judgment, not to be punished, but to be weighed by its light. And in the teachings of Jesus, that light is love. In Urantia, it is service. In the heart of every true path, it is surrender, the willingness to become again what we were before the world taught us to forget. Dust animated by breath, clay made conscious, ash destined for glory. This is not merely the tale of Persia. It is the tale of all who fall and rise again, of all who wander and then remember the way home, of every civilization that forgets its soul, and of every soul that dares to awaken. It is your story. It is mine, and it is not finished. There is a call, rising in the world again, not from empires, but from within. A call to rebuild the temples of the Spirit, to walk in the light, not because we are unbroken, but because we're being remade, to honor the past, not by returning to it, but by letting it teach us how to go forward with humility, to remember that even now, the fire still burns, and it can make of us, and of every nation, something luminous again. So if your soul has wandered, let it return. If it has grown cold, let it be kindled. If it has forgotten its song, let it be sung. The same voice that once called to prophets still calls to us. The same light that once guided kings still waits at the edge of our decisions. You're not too late. The story is not too far gone. What was begun in stars will not end in dust. Let the nations rise. Let the souls awaken. Let the glory return, not in gold or conquest, but in light, in truth, in love. And if you enjoyed this content, leave a comment telling us where you're from. Share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel. Every day we release new videos to nourish your soul.